The hot rod shop truck's going back under the knife. The intake manifold's got some leaks. Let's get them fixed. So I recently noticed some oil leaking out of the front of the intake manifold right on top of my timing chain cover. And it looks like it's the RTV right up in this front corner here that seems to be just kind of like seeping a bit. I've also noticed some discoloration of the intake manifold gasket, and it started around each of the manifold mounting bolts. Now those bolts thread into the oil passages, so I probably forgot to add thread sealant to those bolts. So since the intake's got to come off anyway, I'm going to apply some thread sealant to those bolts. Got to start by draining the coolant, removing your throttle body or carburetor, depending on which one you're working with. Get all the electrical connections out of the way. Get any hoses out of the way. Then you can start removing your intake bolts. And while you're doing that, realize you forgot to remove your oil pressure sensor. So yeah, hopefully you can see, it looks like only maybe a couple of those intake bolts look like they had any kind of thread sealant on them. And even then it was minimal. Oops. So one of the good things about these small block Mopars is in order to remove the intake, you don't have to pull the distributor and you shouldn't have to pull the valve covers. Find a spot you can get under there. Start slowly and carefully breaking stuff free. And there it is. All right, so the intake is off and I went through. It actually looks really good. You could definitely see in this corner, there was some oil underneath the RTV. It pulled right up, wasn't even stuck down really. So it was definitely seeping out of this corner. And then I went through and I sopped up any coolant that may have leaked down into the valley. There was a little bit just along this side, since I kind of pried the intake that way. Any coolant left in it kind of ended up next to the lifters on this side. So I went through with some rags, sopped all that up. But now I just got to go ahead and I got to clean up both the front and rear china walls, get those all ready for some more RTV, get the mating surface cleaned up for the intake manifold, and of course, clean up the intake manifold itself. So now I'm going to take some time to run a thread chaser down through all of the intake mounting bolt holes. Now, all of them except for the very end ones do thread, they're wet holes, so they do thread into the oil passage. So I've just got a rag here, I'm going to move it along to each one, just in case any crud falls out, the rag will catch it instead of ending up down inside there. I have to try to wipe it down. Just use a rag to catch any schmutz that might fall down inside there. Now that all the bolt holes are cleaned out, I'm gonna go ahead and start scraping down the china wall using the good old super scraper. Scrape all that RTV off there. Got a rag in there to catch anything that might fall inside. And then once that's done, I'll wipe it down and I'll follow it all up with a good vacuuming with a shop vac. all of the old RTV cleaned up. Everything's been cleaned, wiped down, prepped, ready to go. It's time to get messy. The plan is to lay a nice fat bead of Permatex Ultra Gray RTV across the front and rear china walls, and that's going to help the intake manifold seal on the front and back rather than use the cork gaskets. And I really want to concentrate on getting a good fat bead right in the corners where the head meets the block. I'm going to really seal that area real well, front and back. I also like to add a little bit of RTV, just a light coating around the front and rear water passages, just to kind of help that intake gasket seal there. I know Felpro says, especially with these gaskets, not to use any kind of sealant, but I feel just a light coat of RTV on there would just help it seal with that water passage a little bit better. And I've had good luck doing it, never had any water leaks anyway into the block or anything like that. So, and as far as the gaskets go, I'm also going to be using some of this Permatex gasket sealant, not as a sealant, but I'm going to use it as a glue. I'm going to be adding it pretty much maybe around some of the bolt holes and in the middle, just to kind of help hold the gasket in place until I can get the intake on. It just keeps it from sliding around. And then for all the intake bolts, I'm going to be using some of this thread sealant on each of the bolts that go down into the oil passages, since apparently I forgot that before. But it's time to just go ahead and start getting this thing back together. Well, apparently I hit record, but apparently I didn't hit record when I was putting the intake bolts in place. So all of the bolts, except for the four corners, got thread sealant on them, since they all, like I said, go into the oil passage, and they're not torqued down yet. I just got them snug just to hold the intake in place while that RTV sets up. If you haven't seen my Tool Tech Tuesday yet on this thing, this is the tube grip. Guys, this thing makes applying RTV so much easier. You're not having to like fight with the tube, fight with trying to get all the last bit of it out. Your hands cramping, trying to squeeze a good thick bead on there, especially if you're working with like a smaller bead where the tip is really small. We all know that can, be a little difficult to push sometimes. The tube grip, guys, I'll leave a link down below. Go check it out. So there's one more thing that I want to do while I'm in here. Famous last words in hot rodding, right? While I'm in here. I want to replace the front and rearmost exhaust manifold bolts with studs. The reason being is that if I ever have to, say, replace an exhaust gasket or a header gasket, those front and rear exhaust manifold bolts thread into the water jacket. So in order to remove the exhaust, I have to drain the coolant. And that is just a pain. So I'm gonna pull those bolts out. I got some exhaust studs. I'm just gonna coat the threads in thread sealant and run these in. Got the intake installed and torqued. Exhaust studs in place. I don't have the nuts yet. I went to the hardware store and all I could get was chrome. So I ordered some black oxide nuts, so they'll be here tomorrow. So those will get installed tomorrow, which is fine because I'm not gonna fill this thing up with fluids until everything has had time to really cure, especially those exhaust studs. I want that thread sealant to really cure in there before I go and add coolant back into the system. I just got to go ahead and put the poly sniper back on, which I'm not going to do that obviously until I put coolant in the system. So yeah, I think coolant will go back in tomorrow once everything's had a chance to cure overnight. So there's no point really putting everything else back on. So yeah, I think that's going to do it for this video. Appreciate you for watching. Hit that subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you on the next one.